Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fifth and final online web clinic as part of our Latinas in Leadership series here at Vote, Run, Lead. It's actually not the final web clinic. It is for 2014, but I'm excited to share with everyone that we are doing 5 more in early 2015 with our partner, Latinos Represent, Political Parity, and NHLA. So I'm super excited about continuing this as we move forward into 2015 with 5 more sessions. And we do take your evaluations and feedback very seriously. So when this webinar ends, make sure that you say all the things you want to see in next year's web clinic. We have a really fantastic session called Election Analysis. What was our impact and how can we grow our power? Specifically looking at the Latino and Latina vote, Latina candidates in this election, what happened. You have 2 fantastic presenters. I'm so excited to have them both on board with us. As many of you know, Vote, Run, Lead is a national nonpartisan organization. We do this all the time. We have each of these each of these web clinics about once a week. On Thursdays at 2 o'clock is usually our regular time, if not Tuesdays at 2 p.m. And we're hoping that Nadia is able to join us in just a moment from Political Parity to tell you a little bit about Latinos Represent. But if she can't, we can do that at the end as well. Not a problem. I'm just checking the web box. So what I actually think we'll do, it's a little bit spotty, so we'll just give the presenter a minute to log in. What I'll do is I'll just do a quick introduction. The woman you see on the screen is Shauna, who, a little quick story, was actually my first intern job director. My first internship was at the White House Project, and Shauna was my boss. And so the world is small and mighty. And actually, I love to tell this joke because it's not a joke, it's the truth. She used to make me file everything. That was my internship for the first 6 weeks. I wanted to kill her. But now, I love her, and it was one of the most amazing internships I had. It changed my career as to what I wanted to do. And so many of you owe this beautiful new organization, Vote, Run, Lead, to Shauna making me file with joy. And Professor
make me cry, Erin.
And we also have Professor Anna Sampaio now she's at Santa Clara University, but I first met Anna in Colorado when she did quite a bit of work with us with Vote, Run, Lead through the White House Project, doing trainings with not only her and your husband also did them with us, which is also great. So 2 women that are dedicated to this work, are experts on the subject of politics, women's leadership, race in America. This is going to be a pretty intense conversation. And so I'm excited. You all know that your chat functions are along the left-hand side. Please ask your questions. You'll see me pop in and out. We don't have Alma on screen today, so you'll just hear from her. But remember, Anna and Shauna, we can hear you typing, so do refrain from typing because it comes in nice and clear. But before we get started, I just want to, thanks. Great. I want to welcome Nadia from Political Parity Project and Latinos Represent to just say a few words before we get started.
Hi, sure. So thank you all for joining us today. We're really excited to do a nice post-election debrief celebration for some, not for others, but for Latinas in general across the country. Unfortunately, I was really looking forward to revising a lot of our research materials, but it doesn't look like a lot of the numbers for Latinas have changed across the country. Basic research, we started to try to figure out why Latinas are so underrepresented. Last year, we went to 14 cities and 9 states across the country, talking with people on the ground. We had focus groups, interviews with elected officials, trying to figure out why this population is so underrepresented, especially when it's one of the fastest growing segments of the population. And so we didn't want a lot of our research and the concepts and ideas uplifted by these communities to sit on the shelf in a research booklet, so we took them out to cities. And so far, we've been to Los Angeles, Denver, Miami, San Antonio, Boston, and New York. And this web series now is a continuation of that work so we can reach pockets of the country we haven't been able to so far. And we're excited to announce that in January, we're launching a new website, and we hope that you will all participate in holding an event in your community, and we'll share a lot of research and resources on how to do that, and we've just been delighted to see all you participate from across the country and are excited to continue working with you and sharing facts and statistics on Latina representation and continuing storytelling and highlighting the role models who are really changing the face of politics. And I'm delighted that one of my professors is on the line today, Shauna. We're so happy to have you, and Anna, we're delighted to have your research too, so thank you. And feel free, I'll put my contact information in the corner in case you want to get in touch with me about figuring out how to hold a Latinas Represent event in your community. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Nadia. Great. And for anybody who wants to see this in the future, you can get it under the VRL Live section of Go Run. You can also find it on the Latinas Represent new website coming as well. So this information is for you. All right. So with that, Shauna, I'll turn it over to you. And when I pop up, you'll know we've got a couple of questions for you. So take it away. Thank you.
Great. Wonderful. First of all, what a lovely introduction. Thank you, Erin, and thank you, Nadia. It is the greatest pleasure of my life to see former students and interns running the world now. So I hope, Erin, can people get these slides later so that I can go quickly through some of the intricate data?
Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
So folks on the call, I'm not going to linger over the data too much, but as I started to pull this together, I got a little greedy about how much data I wanted to share with you. And I don't want to take too much of Anna's time, so I might go a little quickly. And if you have questions, just write them in the bar, and through some magic that Erin does, she can ask me them. I won't see them, but she will. Okay, so I wanted to start by giving some basic demographics about women in the U.S. population versus women in the Congress. And you can see on your screen this slide. So if you look at the left-hand women in the U.S. population, what you see is that white women are about a third of the population, and women of color are about a third also. And the Black women are about evenly represented in Congress, but Latinas are not. Asian Americans also about even. Latinas are underrepresented, and that's one of the reasons that we did this Latinas Represent project for parity. And I'll suggest as we go through one of the reasons why that might be. Oops. All right. And I'm so sorry to report that looking at the results from the latest election just last week, we don't have a lot of change. So this is kind of tiny text, and I won't go through all the names, but you can look them up. You've got the state, and you probably all know these people. And as you know, unfortunately, the basic rule of politics is that incumbents almost always win. As a political scientist, I can say that with certainty, and that was true here. So anybody who was an incumbent in Congress, any Latina who was an incumbent won. And generally, almost all of the challengers did not. The only new face is Norma Torres from California. She was running for an open seat that was vacated by another Latina. So it is not a change in the numbers of Congress. We had a chance this year. This is an incredible slate of Latinas running, I think more than we've ever had. But being almost all challengers, it was not very successful in creating change, unfortunately. The news is a little bit better for governors or lieutenant governors or other statewide office, but it's not terribly better because the numbers are so small, as you can see here. So again, the incumbent, Susana Martinez, was reelected. One woman running for an open seat in Rhode Island, the Secretary of State, was elected. And surprisingly, this is the one exception to the incumbent rule. Evelyn Sanguinetti in Illinois was elected lieutenant governor as a challenger. But that's pretty rare. Really what we need to do is get more Latinas running for open seats. And unfortunately, with redistricting, there's fewer and fewer of those. So one thing, as you probably all know, but just to get the numbers under our belt, is that Latinos and Latinas in the U.S. population are growing enormously. So this is just between 2000 and 2010. You see the U.S. Census data about population growth. More than half of the population growth comes from Latinas, who, as you saw before, are not half of the population. So it's an incredible amount of population growth. And that's going to quickly change the demographics of this country, which I think should lead to more political opportunities. Although we have to translate from population to voters, and so far we're not doing that enough. So looking specifically at women, the growth in the female population between 2000 and 2010 is, as you can see, enormously Latina. Latinas will soon overtake Blacks, well, African Americans, as the major minority group in this country. And if census projections are right, in a couple decades may no longer be a minority. So to look at who these Latinas and Latinos are, this is from, let's see, Pew Hispanic. And if you guys want to use these data, I gave you all the references. You should be able to find that, but feel free to contact me if you can't find the data. But I just think it's always important to say when I teach Hispanic politics to my students or when I'm speaking about it, the vast majority of the Hispanic population is native born. And that's growing, right? That was not as true in 2000, and it's more true, as you can see, in the 2012 percentage column. All right. And even if they are not native born, more than most people think are citizens. So I just like to dispel stereotypes that way. Also important to know that if you look among the many different nationalities that Hispanics identify with, Mexican is the vast majority, again, about 64%, followed by Puerto Rican, and then Cuban and Salvadorian, and you can see all the others. But the others tend to be pretty small. It's important to keep in mind. This is mostly Mexican with a little Puerto Rican that we're talking about as our kind of idea of Hispanic. And the differences are very important, and it's not always, and I'm sure that Anna will talk about this, that these groups unite into kind of one unified group of Latinos or Latinas. But if you do think about them as a unified group for a second, one thing that Parity noticed when we looked at the majority-minority districts in Congress is that Latinos and Latinas, Hispanics as a group, are the least well represented in terms of districts. So this is a little bit of a weird chart, but let me explain. There are districts that are majority-minority, and then districts that are majority-white. The first three bars from the left are majority-minority, Black, Asian, Hispanic. And then there's white plurality and white majority. Almost all districts, except for the Hispanic districts, are represented by a congressperson who is the majority race or ethnicity in that district, except for Hispanics. So that's only about half, whereas it's up around the 90s and 100% for the others. So important underrepresentation. And so I just wanted to end by looking at Latinas as voters, because as you can see, even though Latinas are 16% of the women in the United States, of the women as voters, Latinas are only 8%. It's using about half of the power that they could have. And that's about representative in terms of the women in Congress. So the Latinas in Congress represent Latinas as voters, although they are not representing Latinas in the day. I'm sure there'll be questions, and I'm happy to answer at the end.
Absolutely. Thanks, Shauna.
Sure.
Professor, Anna, go right ahead. I think we will save a couple of the questions. I've got a couple, but I know you're going to hit on a few things, so let's take it away.
Okay. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Great. So just I want to say hey to everybody out there. I know some folks, Christina and Maliga personally, and just I'm happy to be on this platform. So today I want to talk a little bit about the actual vote turnout and what that meant, what we can kind of take away from it. Let me start by the kind of focusing on some of the anticipation prior to the election, because what was really interesting in the build-up to this race is that there was certainly a lot of hope that Latinos would play an important role, given that they are increasing, as Shauna said, not only in terms of the population, but they are increasing in terms of their representation as part of the electorate. So, you know, from Pew, we know that since 2010, the number of Hispanic eligible voters has increased by 3.9 million. In places like Kansas, where my colleague Christina is at, we see a significant growth in the electorate since 2000. There's been a 575% growth of Latino registered voters. And it's, Kansas is not an outlier here. In places like Georgia, North Carolina, New Hampshire, Arkansas, we see over a 200% increase of Latinos registered voters. And it's also the case that Latinos have played a really significant role in the last election. So if you look at some of the data from 2012, I think this is really interesting because when we think about how Obama got reelected in 2012, there's a lot of talk about this coalition of a new electorate, looking at Latinos, whites, blacks, women, young people, and independents. But if you look at this 2012 data, what's really interesting is looking across the various groups, Latinos are the only population in 2012 who not only increase their share of the electorate so that they become 10% of the electorate, but equally important is that they actually increase in that year their support for Obama. Latinos are the only group within that new electorate that does those two things, right? Some groups increase their share of the electorate, like young people, but they actually decrease their support for Obama. And so Latinos are the only ones. So it's an important note here in the power and the decisiveness of the Latino vote, especially in 2012. But if you look down at the table 2 there, what I think is even more interesting is that increase in the Latino vote really comes on the backs of Latinas. So that it's Latinas that help play a decisive role in 2012 in the reelection of Obama, as well as some of the other candidates in various different state races. So given these two trajectories, right, given the role, this really significant role that they played in 2012, given the growing members in the electorate, there was a lot of anticipation that we would see an impact in this race. However, that's not what we saw, both because of the smaller turnout. So what we estimate right now is that the total Latino vote in 2014 was only about 8% of the electorate. But even more importantly here is the weaker support for Democratic candidates, right? So that there is a lessening of support for Democratic candidates. Now, I want to make a note here because that doesn't necessarily translate into a greater support for Republican candidates. It's not that people are disaffected with or disenchanted with Democrats in this race and then turning Republican, because I've heard that said before. The chair of the Republican National Committee was on NPR just last week talking about how successful they were. And the data that we have, and there are some different sources of data, and so there's a little bit of debate about this, but the best data that we have suggests that's just not true. Right. So what you see in this table is the loss of support from Democrats from 2010, which was the last midterm election, really, if we're going to compare apples and apples, that's what we want to compare. From 2010 to 2014, you see in the House races and the Senate races and governor's races a loss of support for Democratic candidates. And there is some uptick among Republicans, but not a wholesale shift. If we look here at Table 4, we get a more even detailed picture. And so if you look at the individual races, particularly some of the really competitive races, say in Colorado, in, Florida, actually Florida is an uptick. But if you look down this row of, say, governor's races, and then certainly if you look towards the right-hand side of comparisons between 2010 and 2012 or 14 in the Senate races, you see the same decline in support for Democratic candidates, right? So, one of the lessons here for me is that if 2008 and 2012 really cemented the significance of the Latino vote, both in terms of turnout and strength of support for the Democratic candidates, then 2014 really demonstrated the cost to those Democrats when the support fades. And the lack of support and particularly lack of advocacy on key issues was really key to the loss of voter enthusiasm and even to some voter confusion. If you look here, when from the data that we have now, in response to what people perceived as the most important issues, by and large, what comes up is not jobs in the economy, but immigration reform. And it's interesting here because we can see between both Latinos and Latinas, immigration reform really is solidified as the top issue. Across different age groups, it's solidified as the top issue. Between Mexicans and Central Americans, it's the top issue. Where we see some deviation is among Cubans, among Puerto Ricans, and among Latino Republicans. So, you know, amongst those populations, there's some, you know, certainly some a little more concern about jobs in the economy, but immigration turns out to be the single greatest issue that they're concerned about in this last election. And one of the troubling things that we saw, you know, Colorado is a really great case study here, is the both deliberate desire not to run on immigration. So the silencing of talk on immigration, the lack of representation. At the national level, we know that there was a forestalled executive action on immigration purposely for trying to avoid any controversy around the elections. And that had a real effect on voters. So, you know, there's additional data that talks about voter enthusiasm, and there is certainly a downtick in terms of voter enthusiasm for Democrats on this issue, particularly related to this issue of immigration. You know,
Erin, when you say, I want to dig a little deeper into that, so if folks aren't talking about this sort of silence on immigration, what's happening? Is that candidate losing those votes to their opponent, or is there just no turnout? Okay.
Well, okay, so again, let's look at Colorado. Let me see if this is apparent, and then I'm going to forward to the next slide. Let's see, this is the governor's race. I'm going to forward here real quick to the, this is the Colorado, these are the Senate race outcomes in terms of support from Latinos and Latinas. So one of the things, first of all, you can see here is the difference in levels of support for Democratic candidates between Latinos and Latinas, as well as difference in levels of support between Latinos and Latinos for Republican candidates. But again, I want to focus on Colorado because this is one of the more important made a decisive difference in the outcome of those races. So you have, in this case, Mark Udall, who's running for re-election, and you know, Erin knows this, and other folks I'm sure know this. Mark Udall has a long history of advocacy on immigration reform. This is not somebody who in the past has been silent or quiet about this. And he's facing a challenger, Courtney Gardner. But Udall, and more specifically, the Democratic National Committee makes a decisive decision to not run on immigration. That's not embraced as part of this platform. And so there's a deliberate silencing of that on that issue. And what's interesting here is then Cory Gardner's race runs a kind of misinformation campaign, right? So that there's, he in fact critiques, it's a really interesting thing. Cory Gardner is completely opposed to immigration reform, especially the bill that was passed in the Senate and then passed on to the House. He's opposed to that, but what he does is he openly critiques Mark Udall for failing to move on immigration reform. So there's this impression as if Cory Gardner is carrying the banner for immigration reform. And that shows up in this really interesting data. I didn't table it here, but there's really interesting data about asking people, well, was Cory Gardner in favor of immigration reform? Was he opposed to immigration reform? And what was Mark Udall's opinion? And what it turns out is that over half the Latino population in Colorado was confused about whether Mark Udall was supportive or opposed to immigration reform. And in fact, a good deal of the Latino population actually believes that Cory Gardner is in favor of immigration reform. So in effect, what we have is misinformation that can act as a demobilizing effect. So what that does is not only discourages people from the Democrats, but can also work, that misinformation work to discourage people from turning out to vote altogether. And certainly we didn't see the turnout in Colorado that we had seen in other races. So it's interesting here about the absence of talk on immigration, the absence really of representation on a key issue that Latinos have said is particularly important to them, and the effect then for the effect for Democrats particularly. I just want to back up here since I've ran through these slides really quickly. So here we see kind of general overview of the differences between Latinos and Latinas in terms of their support for House Democrats, Democrats in the governor's races and Democrats in the Senate races, and then commensurate support in terms of Republicans. And this is interesting to note that there are these growing differences between these populations, But what's, I think, even more interesting is when we look at the individual state levels, right? So here is where you begin to see that gap between Latinos and Latina preferences appear, and particularly in competitive state races, again, such like as Colorado or Kansas. What's equally interesting, I think, is when you look at the races where there is not really a competitive race. Now, Nevada, California, these are both states in which either the Republican candidate was a clear had a clear preference, or in the case of California, Jerry Brown had, there was no poll in which indicated that at any time that he was unlikely to win. So they really were not competitive races, and what you see in those non-competitive states is that gender gap really virtually disappears, right? So it's in these competitive races where we see this gap really appear, and it's interesting to me because it's not only a gap between levels of support, and so, my colleague here, Christina, can talk about this as well. But there's been what we've seen over the last several years is this gender gap emerging in terms of support for Democrats. The traditional gender gap that we talk about is a gap that appears between men and women in terms of their party differences, so that women tend to be more Democratic, men tend to be more Republican. But amongst Latinos and Latinas, the gap tended to be between supportive Democratic candidates. But in places like Colorado, and again, Florida is kind of an outlier in this election, but like Colorado, what we're seeing is not only a difference in terms of support for Democratic candidates, but a pretty interesting difference in terms of party support as well. So Latina gap looking a little bit more like a traditional gender gap, in other words. And again, we see that in those competitive races, that a gap appear more strongly, and then in races where there's a non-competitive election. The only other thing I want to mention here in terms of Latinos and Latinas here to Nevada, Brian Sandoval don't carry the same amount of vote that a Democratic candidate in those states carries. So if you saw, for instance, in previous gubernatorial races in Nevada, the Democratic candidate would carry a larger share of the Latino vote. What is interesting here is the percentage of Latinos that they do get. So there's a lesson here for Republicans, which is high-quality Republican Latinos can actually capture a pretty significant share of the Latino vote, and certainly Nevada is really evidence of that. He carries almost half of the Latino and the Latino vote in Nevada, and Susana Martinez handily wins her reelection with a significant share of Latinos as well. So there's a real lesson here in part for Republicans about the necessity of recruiting Latino candidates, both Latino and Latina candidates, and their ability to successfully bring Latinos into the party who otherwise are disaffected from the party. Okay, so I'll wrap up here with just a few notes. So one, Latinos are continuing to grow in size and significance, and this is interesting both for traditional states like California, Texas, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, but also non-traditional states, as I said, in places like Kansas and Arkansas, North Carolina, New Hampshire. It's also evidence of some stuff that we know. Everybody, I'm sure, on this line has, had this drilled into them. Mobilization matters, as does representation on key issues. I mean, this is a lesson certainly for Democrats on the issue of representation on immigration and the failure to both represent and act on that issue. But it's also a lesson for Republicans. There is no love lost from Latinos to Republicans on this issue of immigration. I do think there's also, as I said, this lesson for Republicans about what effect a Latino Republican can have, and the ways in which the presence of a high qualified or high quality Latino candidate can have in making inroads to the Latino community. And then finally, and I'm sure we can talk about this more, immigration will likely continue to play an important role in Latino attitudes to candidates and parties, especially in the 2016 election. It's not lost, I'm sure, on many of you that Obama, in his first official press conference after the election, reiterated the fact that he's going to take executive action on immigration, and he said so before the end of this year. So that's likely to generate both an important response among Latinos as well as probably backlash, not probably, but undoubtedly backlash, particularly among Republicans. So I will leave it there, and I'm sure folks have some questions.
Absolutely. It's a lot of information. So anyone who I've got a couple of questions in my mind. No question is too small. We've got a couple of questions popping up in the chat. The first one I want to ask comes, what happens when a Latino or Latina candidate runs for office who's, against immigration reforms? Is there an ethnic kinship there, or is there a policy preference in the voting booth, or have you seen, like a Susana Martinez, someone who's, got some mixed views on immigration reform, still carries that vote?
Right. Right. I mean, the best example, like I was just thinking as well, is Susana Martinez, right? So she comes out pretty boldly against driver's license for undocumented immigrants in the state, and supporting Border Patrol and increasement in the border region, and yet still, campaigns as part of this immigrant narrative. So it's really interesting if you look at her speech at the Republican National Committee, in which she sort of invokes this kind of immigrant dream that her parents had and how that's instilled in her. So I do think there's a bit of a lessening of the effect of that negative immigration in her case relative to somebody like Lamar Alexander or Cory Gardner or Mike Hoffman in Colorado. These folks campaigning on immigration reform in a negative and restrictive fashion certainly seems to have a greater negative effect on Latino voters.
Thank you. Shauna, the next question I'm thinking, we have we have another question coming up, but I want to also go back to this opening slide around the incumbency, and excuse me, folks, just a couple more clicks, particularly when it comes to the House races. Yeah. If we could dig a little bit into that, that's a little bit disheartening, I will say, right?
It is very.
We know that it's tougher for anybody, male or female, to be a challenger, but do you have any insights into some of this? Was it just a tough year? We saw some incumbents across the board that, in my mind, were pretty terrible and needed to kind of get out. And the folks went with incumbents this year in a big way. So
I know I wouldn't read too much into this about Latina candidates specifically, though, Erin. I mean, I think what we're seeing is incumbents working to protect themselves and each other, and the state legislatures redistricting so much in kind of this gerrymandering and partisan way, that the incumbent districts are just safer than ever. I think Latinas here face the problems that all non-incumbent candidates face, and it's just harder to get in than ever. It's harder for any outsiders to get in. It's harder for women, and it's harder for people of color, and it's especially, as we see, hard for non-incumbent women of color. So I don't think it's about Latinas specifically. Although I certainly, listening to Anna's presentation, I certainly think this was not a good year in terms of who stayed home. That could have helped, but it was a really depressing set of races, if I may add my own opinion. So, I voted because I always vote, but there was nothing exciting or enjoyable about the campaigns this year. And I understand people not voting. It's fairly depressing, and I think a lot of people felt that, and we had lower turnout than we should have, and that's part of the problem. But it becomes a cycle where if you don't think your vote will make a difference, it's pretty rational not to take the time. So that's really unfortunate, and that's what we need to change. It may also relate to campaign finance and the huge amounts of dark money and all kinds of other, this is my own research about the kind of depressing effect on the electorate and the depressing effect on candidate ambition to run in the kinds of conditions we've created for candidates now.
Right.
So
I do want to get back to that.
Uplifting about that, but I think that
right.
It's not Latina specifically.
Absolutely. I definitely want to get back to the conversation around sort of systems, the gerrymandering districts, and how it really affects not only women but communities of color. We've got a couple questions. Some are coming in just to me, the presenter, and some are in the chat. But we've got Marcella from Washington, D.C., who says, on table 5, and Anna, if you didn't mind finding me table 5.
Sure.
So she's wondering how long have respondents been in the state. She's curious if the top issues rank changed based on, particularly immigration change, on how long folks have been there. So I know we saw some difference with Cuban Americans, et cetera, but is there also, is there a first generation effect? Is there, what are some of the other reasons that folks may have some differentiators in there?
So we don't know from this data, because this data didn't, to my knowledge, ask questions about, didn't correlate this with, actually, I think there is some information about whether people are foreign-born or not. But I really think the driving factor here is, one, the effect of a Republican voice not favoring immigration reform. So if you look at, for instance, Cubans on this issue, Cubans tend to be disproportionately conservative and Republican, and so I think that is in part reflected in the immigration reform not being their top issue. But there are also these, other questions about the degree to which immigration is a top concern for Puerto Ricans, because obviously they're already citizens, and so immigration doesn't have the same necessarily, it's important certainly in those communities, but not necessarily the same salience for those populations, given that they have a different political status in the country.
Great. I think that makes sense. We've got a couple more questions, and we're sort of now turning around the conversation around Latinas and some of the advantages or maybe disadvantages that this research and these findings elicit. The first one being the kind of Latina image of sort of running as a strong woman fighting for families. I don't know if you saw any of that in tracking some of the women running for Congress or just in both of your careers. And the idea, last week we had Jennifer Godinez on, and she brought up a good point around lawn signs, and she said, we kind of have this rule about Renly that lawn signs don't vote, right? They're expensive, et cetera. Yeah. But she brought up a great point around, Hernandez might be the first time that somebody's seeing that on a lawn sign, so you want to get that out early. You want to sort of, it's a new name for the community to be voting for. So are there, in looking at some of these these results, are there a couple of lessons we might, particularly for Latina candidates, or folks, particularly around voter ID laws, right? Are there things that we should be working on as a community around some of the systemic change, Shauna, that you've talked about? Let's move the conversation around moving forward. How can we make this a little bit different for next year?
So for me, I'm still really interested this is Anna, sorry. I'm still really interested in the structural obstacles that exist here and the lack of attention to mobilization. So a couple of things, and again, this is drawing from the election poll from Latino decisions. One of the questions that they asked people and Latinos that they sampled was why they did not vote in 2014, and there's a surprisingly high number of people who didn't vote for, not because of lack of motivation, but because of these structural constraints. So for instance, 25% said that their schedule doesn't allow enough time to go off to vote, and I'm presuming those are probably in places where early voting is not available. 25%, right? Fully a fourth of the people that, those that are surveyed. 24% don't know where their polling place is, so there's certainly still questions about accessibility of polling locations. 14% of voters said they did not have the proper voter ID, and so yes, as Erin mentions, the changes in voter ID requirements and certainly those that are becoming more restrictive, and we've known this from past research, has a disproportionate effect on young voters as well as Latino voters. But there's also some interesting data here about whether people were even asked to vote, that is, whether or not they were actually mobilized. And among respondents in the survey, more than half of the Latinas said they were not contacted and asked to vote. So fully half of these Latinas who we know are eligible to vote were not mobilized. That where they were mobilized, it tended to more likely happen by Democrats than Republicans, but fully half were not contacted to vote. Now, I live in a really high-profile area. I'm in a competitive congressional race. I had no shortage of mailers, people coming knocking my door, people calling me to, not my husband who was offended by this, to get out and vote. But, the fact that there are so many Latinas out there that are not being contacted really says something, particularly about the parties and the candidates and their failure to mobilize in these communities.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about some of that structural, go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say I'm in complete agreement that I think structure is the main issue here, and my own research and others that I read and think about on this are pretty clear on this, that the system is set up really terribly. It's kind of like a perfect storm right now that keeps outsiders of all stripes out. And I think it's getting worse with the Citizens United and the money. I think it's getting worse rather than better in some ways. So the things that we could do, and you say next year, and that's why I laughed, Erin, because it's unfortunate. I think we have made a structural mess that cannot be resolved in 1 year. But the things that we should be working on are things that make it easier and more attractive for people to run, for Latinas to run in the first place, and then easier and more attractive for Latinas to get to the polls, right? So Election Day should absolutely be a national holiday, like most other developed nations do that. To me, it's a no-brainer. It's difficult because that's in the Constitution that it happens on a Tuesday. But some things we could do in the meantime are more access to ballots earlier or mail-in. Oregon does all mail-in ballots. It seems to not have hurt the credibility of their elections any. I mean, we could make it far easier to vote than we do. And particularly for people who are not as likely to have the kind of professional jobs where you can leave for a couple hours and not get penalized for it. That would make a big difference. Things for candidates, like one of the things that Nadia and Malaga wasn't there yet, but she's read it, but that Nadia and I heard a lot in the interviews that we did of Latinas who could be good candidates but aren't running, had to do with the amount of travel time and time away from their families that would come with being candidates. And one simple thing is just that you do not get to use the money that you raise as a candidate to replace lost salary right now. We don't think that being a candidate is an important enough job to pay you to do. So people who do it are disproportionately wealthy and in professional jobs, and they can take a leave of absence from a law firm or whatnot, and they have all kinds of institutional support that people who are not in those jobs do not have. Child care. One thing we heard a lot was that women tend to be, even if not the sole child care providers, the family managers of their families. That this is a problem for Latinas thinking of going to the state legislature, say, or somewhere where you could be in elective office to build up credibility before running for Congress. The states where Latinas have a larger percentage of the population and where Latinas could be great candidates often tend to be larger geographically. And getting to the state legislature, you can't just, I used to live in Massachusetts. You could drive up to the state house pretty quickly. Right. You can't do that in California. So geography was a huge problem, and we also don't set up politics in a way that's really accommodating to people who have children. Like it could be, I remember when the women took over the Welsh Parliament, there was devolution in the UK, and the Wales got its own parliament, and a bunch of women came in, and they ended the midnight sittings that were traditional for the Welsh Parliament. It might have been the Scottish Parliament, but whatever it is, the women came in and they said, this is ridiculous. Nobody needs to be doing votes and sittings at midnight, and I have kids, so we're going to end everything by 5 p.m., and that made a big difference. So just structurally, it's not set up for women, but it could be. But we're in a bit of a catch-22 because you need to get women in to change it first. So yeah, some of the money stuff would be crucial. Some of the helping candidates run stuff would be crucial. And then once you can get enough women in to just make a little bit of a difference, like you may not require somebody to come in on a weekend or something, so people could go back to their families.
And let's stick with that. We have a question from Teresa from Washington around, on some of these, we had a big election on women, right? Again, right? It's just framed a little differently each time, but around equal pay, reproductive health. Looking at some of the Latina candidates, big picture, did folks that seem to embrace that agenda? Did they suffer? Do we feel like they suffered for it? How do some of the sort of bigger pictures, particularly around pay equity, bigger picture women's issues come into play for some of the Latina candidates for the House, or just broadly any of the women in the House races?
Shauna, I'm going to defer to you.
Yeah, it's not something that I know about. I didn't hear it come up a lot, and that might have been an opportunity But it was unfortunately just not a big issue, I think, in a lot of these campaigns, and it didn't seem to drive discussion or voters, from what I can tell. But I know Professor Bejarano is on the call. Maybe could we get her input on this?
Professor, if you have some thoughts, do put it in the chat box, and we'll sort of push that back out. But that excitement, right, and sort of the voter turnout, I don't think there were, this is my opinion, of course, but this sort of big, exciting issue of the day. Yeah. You know, if we're talking about, you know, we've got folks on, you know, we've got folks who want to run for local office. How do they get folks excited about their candidacy? I mean, you know, people engage with, when they engage with government, they engage with local government. So, you know, given some of this data, and I'm not an academic, but as a practitioner, I might say that be bold in your agenda. You know, if you have a stronger Latino population, be bold around the immigration stuff, because that seems to be, you know, something that is both good for turnout and you know, and an issue, and sort of an exciter issue. Are there any other themes that you see that we might be able to just extract for folks who are interested in local office?
I do think context is key here, right? I mean, I'm not telling anybody here stuff they don't know, but, and I see Christina is weighing in on the fact that women's issues were big in Texas and Nevada. They were also big in Colorado. So Mark Udall forgoes talk about immigration reform to focus almost exclusively on questions around women's issues, to really negative effect, right? He ends up losing the race very closely by a few percentage points. Had he focused on immigration, it's likely that would have made a difference in terms of him keeping his seat. So it's not that there's an absence of talk about women's issues here, but certainly context is king. And I think that, yes, you can embrace questions, and certainly in Mark Udall's case could have embraced questions about immigration, but there is competitive states that may have not traditionally been, for instance, Democrat. There's unaffiliated voters, what we sometimes call the mushy middle, those people who will swing right Republican or Democrat. And I think there really does have to be a very careful balancing, especially for Latino and Latina candidates in those places, on what they talk about. A colleague of mine and I did a larger study a few years ago about the success of the Salazar brothers, both John Salazar and Ken Salazar, getting elected in Colorado in statewide, or actually in one is in a congressional district and the other was in a statewide race, and doing so with a very strong population of independents and Republicans voting for them. And part of what they did, which is ironic, it's not necessarily something that I think is a strategy that's useful everywhere, but part of what they did is they also engaged in what we call this process of deracialization. That is, recognizing the fact that embracing immigration for them, as opposed to somebody like Mark Udall, would deeply polarize lots of people in their key constituents. They also avoided issues of immigration reform and any issue related to Latinos, and actually were successful in using that as a way to appeal to Latinos and to appeal to Republicans and independents. So context is king here, right? It's got to be, people have to be very savvy and strategic about who they're perceiving as part of their key constituents that they can mobilize.
Right. A question also from Malaga there about if we care so much about immigration, could casting Latinas as single issue voters be harmful? Because women sometimes resent, like especially some of this war on women language has gotten so reductionist that women have resented it. So the main way for me here, and Malaga, I think that's right. Immigration is one of the most important issues that comes up in surveys of Latino and Latina voters. But again, Latinas and Latinas are human beings, they're people, and what everybody cares about is jobs and the economy right now. I mean, that to me would be the central issue that everybody should be talking about. And Aaron, to your question about getting involved in the local level, I'm often surprised that jobs in the economy become such a big deal at the congressional level, because there's like very little that Congress can actually do about jobs in the economy. A lot of these are state issues, and I would think those would play better closer to home. So I would say that. I also think that the Democrats made a huge tactical error in running so far away from Obama. And kind of discounting everything that Democrats and the Obama team have worked on in the last couple of years. It was a very clear election, to my mind, between Republicans who were anti-Obama And then like nothing, no response. There was no clear democratic message. And that I think had a negative effect for Democrats, which was like, well, why should we vote for you? I think that the Republicans have had a monopoly on moral outrage, which makes me a little sad as a Democrat, just because I've got a lot of moral outrage, and I think we could have harnessed more voters through some moral outrage. Like immigration could be a moral issue rather than just, a practical issue of what do we do. It could be a moral issue about citizenship and about human rights. Jobs in the economy could be a moral issue. I certainly think that everybody who wants a job should have a right to one. And for God's sake, healthcare. I mean, we passed the greatest piece of social legislation since the New Deal, and nobody talked about it to defend it, really, except for Obama, who's out there by himself. I think the Democrats could have leveraged that better. It's actually fairly popular, not among everybody, but it is something that the country wanted and got, and nobody used that. And boy, Obamacare and kind of greater access to healthcare makes a huge difference for people who tend to be lower income and need the help. And that could have resonated more, I think, with Latino and Latina voters, but it wasn't used.
Right. Well, it's 2:54, and I want to honor everyone's time. I also want to make a note that all opinions of our presenters are their opinions. Vote Run Lead is a 501c3. No. It's this is what we bring you guys on for, right? We love the chart, and the information, but we are looking for your insights, right? And so I think a couple of things just to sort of wrap this up is, as the population is growing, we need to sort of turn that population into political power, both voting power as well as seeing more of us run for office. I think this also means sort of seeing more of us get involved in these parties. How can Latinas play a role as party chairs, and thinking about these structural reforms, that the way we've set up our democracy is actually keeping out women of color, it's keeping out folks who are not already sitting in those spaces. So very informative. Thank you very much. These charts, the entire program will be available on voterunlead.org. Become a member to access not only this one, but all of them. And of course, we are continuing the series at National Go Run, Latinas in Leadership. We're going to be having a conversation there. There'll be more coming next year. We've got 5 more in this series. So tell your friends, of course. And we've got a wait list going right now for National Go Run, but do let us know if you're interested. What I ask all of you to do at the series end is to invite a Latina to run. Go to Invitation Nation right on our site and send her an e-card that says, I think you should run for office. We know that that's the best way to do it. And they'll get connected to us, and we'll share these resources with them. Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you so much, Shauna. Don't click through, don't close the webinar, folks. We'll close it, and you'll see a link that pops up. And that's your evaluation. And again, since this is the last one on this series for this year, we'd love to hear what you want to see for next year. We read these evaluations very closely and make sure that we are giving you what you want to hear and what you want to see, and the presenters that you might want to see as well. So a big thanks to Political Parity, to NHLA, to Latinas Represent, Nadia, Marnie, the entire team. I think this has been a fantastic first series, and I am so excited to see what we've got in store next year. And thank you both, Anna and Shauna, for being a part of this.
Thanks for organizing. This was wonderful.
Thank you. It's super exciting, too. I love this platform.
It is so cool.
Bye-bye.
Bye, all.